why don't we get started? Thank you all so much for joining us. And I see a couple people, Erica and Matt, have started using the chat. And I do want to encourage you to introduce yourselves. And yes, 7 p.m. in Israel. Perfect. It'd be, if you're in time zones that haven't yet been shown, or in time zones that aren't in the States, love to see that in the chat as well. But please do feel free to introduce yourselves and drop a LinkedIn link or whatever you would like in the chat. We'd like to make sure that this is interactive. So as I guess my Zoom account says, I'm Ed Zimmerman. Welcome to Venture Crush. We will drop a link in, if we haven't already, to an Airtable that shows the panelists for today's event, and you can take a look at their bios. And we are excited about the companies that are part of the VentureCrushFG program for this vintage. And there's an Airtable link as well that will be dropped for that. And we also have a final Airtable link for the dozens and dozens of venture capital investors, predominantly in the US, Africa, and Europe, who have agreed to co-lead and are actively co-leading pods in the VentureCrushFG program, which this panel is part of. This session is going to discuss culture and recruiting, and a little bit on the opposite of recruiting. And you're welcome to drop stuff in the chat, as well as we've gotten a lot of comments through the survey and questions through the survey, and they were great and they were on point, and we appreciate those, and we appreciate your feedback as well. So with that, I'd love to have the panelists, and we'll go in first name alpha order, but maybe we can have the panelists briefly intro themselves, and then we'll get into the discussion. I'll give you a prompt, Andy. You're first.
I was looking, I'm trying to, like, does A come before C, or how are we going to do this? But I'm happy to go first. Thank you, Ed. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Andy Weissman, and I am a partner at Union Square Ventures, venture capital firm in New York City. I've been around for about 15 years. We are a thesis-driven fund, primarily around broadening access to things like well-being, knowledge sharing, capital, and learning. And I'm glad to be here.
And I noticed you didn't mention climate.
Well, we have a new fund. So I would say that's part of that. And for the first time in our history, we raised a fund specific. We broke out one of those areas, climate, and we raised a fund specifically for that. Same team, same exact team, and same LPs virtually.
Great. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in the context of culture also, I hope. All right, so next I think is Charles.
Everybody, I'm Charles Hudson, managing partner at Precursor Ventures. We're a San Francisco Bay Area based pre-seed firm. We make about 25 to 30 investments per year. We're very generalist, focused on finding great companies at that idea stage and working with them predominantly through the Series A.
And if Andy is a thesis-driven investor, are you thesis-list?
I'd say we're thesis agnostic. I wouldn't say we're thesis-list. Thesis agnostic is what I prefer.
Okay. And how long have you been in the venture world, Charles?
About a dozen years now across 3 different firms. 5 years at Precursor, 5 years at Encore, and then 2.5-ish years at Incutel, the CIA's venture capital group. It's always focused on early stage.
And what's the primary difference between doing venture investing a decade ago for the CIA and doing Precursor?
Prices are a lot higher today than they were back then. It's the primary difference. Entrepreneurs were great back then. Also, there's just there was a lot of money spent, and Andy and Jewel and Czech probably remember, there was a lot of money spent on things like servers and hardware and equipment that you had to buy that you couldn't just turn on at the tap from AWS or Twilio. It was more expensive and harder to get started, and investors, your dollar went a little further in the early 2000s than it does today.
And was there a risk at the CIA that, like, if you took something to investment committee and they didn't like it, they might kill you, or that was not part of the deal?
It probably was a risk. I managed to avoid that, thankfully.
We see, yeah.
But I don't think Intel was a lot of fun. It is, to Andy's point about having a thesis, it was nice working at a place that had a clear mandate and thesis of what we were looking for. It made trying to figure out what to spend time on a lot easier. As a generalist, it tends to be whatever I find interesting, which can change day by day.
Excellent. And Czech/Francesca, you're alphabetically next either way, right?
Yeah, I think so. Sorry, I confused you by changing my name halfway through that. But I'm Czech, or Francesca, the co-founder of a fund called Ada Ventures. Ada Ventures is a pre-seed and seed fund. We closed on $50 million at the end of last year. We started investing at the beginning of last year. We are focused on overlooked founders and markets, on making venture much more accessible to anyone. And we invest in, our thesis is really around the 10-year demographic shifts that are being driven by population changes and the world becoming more diverse, more global, women having more status and power, aging populations, and then the Gen Z audience. So we think a lot about things like culture and things like climate as well. But I'm also interested in this conversation because we are starting a new business ourselves. So we're thinking about all the same sort of things that many of the startup founders on the call are thinking about around how do we look after our people, how do we build a culture at Ada ourselves. And it's great to be on a call with two of the members of our steering group. So Ed and Charles, we're very lucky to have you as our steering group members. So it's a kind of reuniting of the Ada family here. And we've got Matt also on the call.
Greatly appreciated and happy to be part of the Ada family. And when you say you're starting a new business, this isn't you announcing your departure from Ada. You mean that you're in year 2 of Ada?
Yeah, we're in year kind of 2.5. I mean, I think venture funds are interesting startups because they take a long time to actually get going. So we started actually in earnest on Ada in sort of June 2018, but we are still figuring out, making our first hire full time in the business right now. We are thinking about things like, what is our culture as a firm at Ada? So yeah, excited to dive into all those questions.
And you and Matt worked together before Ada and were, so is the culture very different because it's the two of you rather than the two of you as part of a larger organization?
Yeah, we worked for an organization that was probably 120 people, billion assets under management. It was more of a corporate firm. And so us spinning out and starting a new fund, it's been amazing because it's allowed us to start things completely from scratch, but also with that comes slight chaos and having to organize that into the right framework and do everything from first principles is, I think, an experience familiar with many of the founders on this call. And I know Charles has done it and various others have done this. So yeah.
And my last question before we go to Jewel, you also started and run something on the side. Do you want to talk about what that is?
Yeah, so whilst I was at my previous firm, I co-founded an organization called Diversity VC, which is a non-profit focused on promoting diversity and inclusion in venture capital and tech. And we have now done quite a few different things, including an internship program. We've developed the first ever standard for inclusivity and diversity for venture funds to have. We've launched in the US and we're slowly taking over the world with it. And it's becoming a kind of a beast in and of itself, but that's something I do on the side.
Great, and I know that we're going to want to talk more about that. And thank you for doing that and for the research that Diversity VC has put out. You've done great work there. Jewel, tell us what's going on in Atlanta and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Lots going on in Atlanta. I don't know if we want to get into that, but To speak on my background, hi everyone, I'm Jewel Burke-Solomon, one of the managing partners at Collab Capital. We are focused on investing in great Black-led innovation companies. The differentiator for our fund is that we are looking for companies that want to build good, sustainable, profitable businesses. And so we think that there are multiple pathways to success for technology and technology-enabled companies. And so we've built out a fund that can really derive value from various pathways. And so that means that we're not looking for binary outcomes like majority of venture capital funds that are kind of chasing unicorns. We think that we'll likely invest in some companies that may go on to be billion-dollar plus companies, but we think there's some really great companies to be found that may just be 10, 20, $30 million companies. And so we want to be able to support them as well.
And so if someone gets feedback from a venture fund that says, not sure that this is a venture sized business, not sure that there's $1 billion+ rapidly growing market here, does that mean that they're still in range for you?
Yep. If we can see a pathway to getting the business to $10 million in annual revenue at a 30% profit margin, that's really what we want to see. And that's how we kind of make a decision on whether or not we can invest. And we believe that in the early stages, it's really hard to tell if a business can actually be a venture scale $1 billion+ business. So what we're doing is trying to give founders time to figure out if they should be on that sort of venture track or if they should be on the pathway to building a profitable business that just grows at a nice pace year over year. And our perspective is that particularly for the Black community, we need more companies to reach that $10 million plus annual revenue mark. And we actually have created a model where we think we can still achieve sort of venture level returns, but we're doing it in a slightly different way, using profit share as a mechanism for deriving value out of those companies that might not be the unicorn scale.
Okay, great. And if people want to ask questions about that in the chat, because I think there's a bunch to unpack there, and I think Jewel's fund, about which I am personally very excited, is a pretty unique venture fund. But Jewel, it would be a mistake for us to gloss over your other job and the fact that you are a startup founder with an exit yourself. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So my other job, mic check, I do a couple things. Also lead Google for Startups in the US. And at Google for Startups, we are really focused on leveling the playing field for startup founders across the world. My focus is in emerging ecosystems in the United States. So being based in Atlanta, I really focus in Atlanta and focused in other cities across the country. So lead programs to help entrepreneurs figure out how to get technical enablement set up, how to use ads in their business, how to think about sales strategy. And then we also had a chance to deploy capital, about $5 million last year in non-dilutive capital to Black founders across the country. I know a few of them are in Charles's portfolio. So we were really excited to be able to do that work as well. And then prior to Collab and Google for Startups, I was a founder myself. I started a company called PartPick back in 2012. Can relate to the notion of having to find places for servers and all of that. When we were building early on, we had to do that. So lots has changed since then, but built the business up and sold it to Amazon into 2016.
Great. And if there are founders who want to get in touch with you for Google for Startups, should they get in touch with you, or is there someplace else we should be directing them?
They should follow Google for Startups on all social channels. We actually have some program announcements coming out pretty soon. So make sure you are following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and that's where we kind of post everything that's coming up with Google for Startups.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for sharing all of that. And So we did this survey, and thank you so much to everyone who completed the survey. And often there's a kind of cluster at the top in terms of what people are most interested in. There's a second level cluster, but the most important question, and I thought this was a curious outcome, not what I anticipated. What are things you are doing or can be doing to care for your team during challenging times? So I'd like to start. I know that's a pretty open-ended question. Let's make that a jump ball for whoever wants it, but let's start with that one.
I'll start, Ed. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think for our teams, we're stumbling through it the way most people are. I think the one thing we're trying to do is listen intensely more carefully at what people are telling us, because you're not seeing it from body language. You're not seeing it from being with people every day. You just have, you have the disembodied head and words. And one thing we found is just to listen really, really carefully and be better listeners about what people may be saying or what they're not saying, to try and understand where their headspaces are or not.
And folks should not wait for me to prompt with a follow-up. You should jump in and definitely talk over me. Go ahead.
I'll take your invitation, Ed. I mean, we're a small team. We're a team of 4 full-time at Precursor, but the fourth person we hired, I've actually never met him. He graduated from Morehouse. He was one of our interns, and we promoted him to full-time without having ever met him. I think the thing we realized is like the work part of work was working pretty well between Slack and email, but we weren't having as much fun as we did as a team in the office. So we've been doing a mix of Airbnb experiences and like other fun things. So just to give you an example, we've been doing things where each person on the team teaches the rest of the team how to do something. So we had our analysts teach us all how to make sweet potato biscuits that were actually like pretty good. We did a cooking class with an Italian grandma. We did a camp at home thing with this like team building company. So we've been trying to find things that are explicitly not work to do together, that work in a remote context, to make sure that in the like hustle of trying to like support the portfolio and close transactions, that we don't lose our personal connections. And probably honestly, the most fun thing we did is our analyst made a Kahoot game of trivia about people in our team. So we had everybody fill out this like 10-minute, it took about 10 minutes to fill out a Google form with all these like funny questions about your childhood and how you grew up. And then he was our trivia MC, and we did a trivia game about everybody on our team. And it was actually really fun. So we've been trying to just find things that are disconnected from like the day-to-day grind of like operating the fund and trying to support the portfolio, and find ways to make sure we're continuing to learn about each other and stay connected.
That's great. Go ahead, Check.
I love that, Charles. And I think we need to do that. We did one just before Christmas, but we don't really do much of that. And I think one of the reasons you go to work is joy. And one of the things that Matt and I have been talking about at the end of last year was kind of how can we bring joy into running our business, because it should be part of it. And otherwise, this is not going to be sustainable if we're just kind of grinding ourselves away. I think for us, we are thinking a lot about flexibility and trying to be more accommodating, because like it or not, work has completely merged with our lives now, with every aspect of our lives. I mean, we're sitting in our bedrooms at home doing work. We don't get to go to the office. And so I think being more empathetic and understanding of needing more of that flexibility is really important. Particularly, I know Matt's on the call. He's got a 4 and a 6-year-old that he's homeschooling. And at the moment in the UK, all the schools are shut. The only places that are open are nurseries. So people are trying to deal with homeschooling their kids as well as doing their work. And that will be different in every country or every part of the world, or everyone's different circumstances. So we're trying to be really sensitive to things like that. And the other thing that's happening in the UK right now is that it doesn't get light before sort of 8 o'clock in the morning, and it gets dark at about 4. So you can imagine it's fairly sort of rubbish if you're working between sort of 8 and 6. So trying to give people the opportunity to go for a run in the middle of the day, or just get out in the sunshine, so that they're not literally going from blackness to blackness when they leave the house for their sort of daily walk. So I think that's all important. Like, I think just one final thing is we're all experiencing a sort of level of trauma at the moment. I think either someone in your family has suffered from something related to COVID, or it's trauma through the political situation we're in. And again, I think we have to completely change the way we as businesses process the separation between work and home life as a result. And I don't know if we're doing that very well ourselves at the moment, but I think it's something that all founders should be thinking about. Like, what is the trauma going on in your employees' lives right now, and how can you help them to manage it?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. One of the things that I've done is try to always answer honestly the question, "How are you?" and give that as, hopefully that is a gateway for the people on my team to also answer it honestly. So that's been useful in that it's opened up a lot of dialogue that I don't think we were having before. And then another thing that we did on the Google side with our program that we ran last year and will continue this year is we offered therapy to all of the companies that participated. So subsidized the entire year basically of therapy for the participants. And that, of all of the things we did in the program, was the one that people talked about the most as being helpful and transformative for them last year. So that's something that I didn't even realize would be so critical for the founders, but and that's something that we'll continue to do moving forward.
Wow. So I want to come back to the therapy and the mental health issue, because that's also a big part of this. Tariq asked a great question, which is, what techniques do you use to improve listening? We can apply that to what techniques do you use to improve empathy, since those are two things that Andy met. I'd also like to explore Charles's comment, we hadn't met him, because we kind of have to change our understanding of vocabulary and what it means to meet or know someone. So feel free to jump in on any one of those three things. What are you doing to be better at or to improve listening or empathy? And what does it mean to have met or not met someone?
I think since I mentioned listening, I'll jump in if that's okay. I think that one of the things that we've done is we're, as investors, people ask our opinion a lot, whether it is warranted or not. So we're used to talking. So one of the things we're trying to do is not talk as much and just listen. We have about 19 people on our team. And so that means there's many more one-on-one interactions and just listening to people, no conclusion. So that's in being a better listener, it's let them say stuff. I think that's point one. The other is recognizing, as Czech mentioned, that there's this boundary between work and life that has been eliminated, I guess, and understanding and acknowledging that, which could mean lots of things. It could mean that this is a Monday morning and you have childcare, so you're not working. But it could mean someone wants to chat and it's 9 o'clock at night, and that's okay too. And as kind of a manager, our obligation maybe, is raised to respond to that, because that happens to be a session that is available for someone. That's on our team. This relates to our companies as well, I imagine, for everyone here, because they're on those same schedules or non-schedules, and their request for guidance or advice we have to react to, the boundaries that have gotten broken down for them as well. So I think for us, or for me at least, it's more just like, stop talking as much. It's hard for a VC.
I think it's hard, just adding to that, around how do you do that when a founder's pitching you, because you are in, they are in sales mode, you're selling them as well, and you can't have that kind of vulnerable conversation. And one of the things that we're thinking about as well, not just our own team, but obviously our portfolio founders and how they're looking after their team, we're trying to listen to them and generally just reach out much more regularly and ask those questions of how are they getting on and how can we support them better. But I think in that time where you're getting pitched by a founder, they're running out of cash, they've probably got a whole load of situations happening in their personal life. Like, how do you create that, break down that barrier? I don't know, Andy, have you experienced anything that's worked there?
You know, I would say the short answer is no. The longer answer is stumbling your way through it. You know, I think that we have about 85 companies in our portfolio, so it's very and as a small fund, it's very easy for us to be focusing less on new investing on the existing portfolio. We wouldn't actually notice that, and so most of that has been that energy or attempt at being a better partner has been focused on the existing companies, and I think for me at least it's an attempt to try and understand actually what you just mentioned, like what's the, there's the text and what's the subtext, and how has that changed when someone who are used to spending a lot of time with, particularly if you're an early stage investor and then you haven't seen for a year, you haven't been to their office, or you haven't done all of that, that trust building, which is I believe should be a core part of venture investor and entrepreneur relationship. And so I think it's a lot of stumbling through, but it's a lot of, I think one thing I found is if you're just kind of quiet, you let people speak, and there is the beginnings of trust, then that's a way to let them, get that stress out where in ways where there would have been other outlets before. And I think the other thing is, I mean, it's stressful running our business. It's stressful for everyone, right? It's stressful for running our business is a different type of stress, but stressful for our business. Charles mentioned too, we had 3 analysts that started in March, and 2 of them never met anyone, and they're at the beginnings of their career. So like the thought process for them is what happens to my career now? I can't meet the people I work with, and they're like a year or 2 out of school, and then they're then they move back and they're in their childhood bedrooms. That's where they're working out of, right? And so, like that type of stuff too. And maybe, if you just, attempt to give people space, attempt to, to do it in a way, maybe by acknowledging that there are no consequences to it, or different types of consequences to expressing kind of like what happened. And so going back to the example of our analysts, I think because of that, we were really lucky. Some of them kind of said, and ours is a 2-year program, some of them kind of said like 2-year program where one of the years is remote, like what, so maybe we'll extend it, but that they felt comfortable enough to raise that as an issue. And that was an enlightening experience for us.
So, Check, you used the word vulnerable, and Jewel, you suggested a pattern interrupt of answering honestly when people ask, "How are you?" And that called to mind 2 very specific things for me. One was there's a fantastic article in the New Yorker from last year that focuses on a place called The Castle, which is a nonprofit that helps people who are justice involved get back into, re-enter after they've come out of the justice system. And one of the things it talks about is in New York, if someone asks you, "How you doing?" the answer is okay, fine, or great. And if you actually answer with more than, one word, you've just told everyone that you don't know what New York is supposed to be like. And they talk about people never having been asked honestly for the answer to that question. And then separately, there was something on Twitter recently where a partner at Harlem Capital suggested that you really should make yourself vulnerable. That actually had an impact on me and changed something I was thinking about doing. I'm glad I did that. But are people making themselves vulnerable, and how surprised are people when you answer honestly, Jewel, and say, "You want to know how I am? Here's the answer. Have a seat."
Well, now it's become a regular practice. So I think people are expecting that I'm going to answer honestly and will call me out if I give too quick of an answer. So if I'm just in the flow, which happens like, back to back to back meetings and just kind of trying to run through them, and I'm asked that question and I don't give the real answer, they're going to ask again, the folks on my team, because one thing about me is that my face usually tells on me. So even if I don't say exactly how I'm feeling, usually people that know me can pick up on, what's not being said. But people that I don't regularly meet with, when I tell them the honest answer, it always works the same way, where it invites them to give me something. So usually at this, with everything that's going on, the honest answer has some meat to it. So that does open up the conversation in a different way. And I think it creates a connection point with people. So obviously I have to use some level of discretion as far as, who I share what details with, but typically, if you talked to me last week, my answer was about what happened in Georgia and my excitement about that. If you talk to me this week, it's a little bit of confusion about what in the world is going on in the US. So it usually does spark some type of dialogue. And I think to the point of having to get to know people in a different way, because most people you're not going to have a chance to meet in person for some time. I think it's important to make those types of connections. And I think that question kind of allows for room for that.
Yeah.
I want to jump in on this because I think if anyone's ever spent time in the UK, you'll know that asking someone how they're doing, you usually get completely inauthentic. I'm absolutely fine, I'm great, everything's going super well, even if your life is a disaster. So I think we're not very good at opening up and being honest about our feelings. And I completely agree. I think that's an amazing way to just shift the conversation from platitudes to something real, and get into that space. I think sometimes the question of how are you can be almost too overwhelming to answer, particularly at the moment, because there's just so much going on. So just saying to someone, how are you today? Or like, how's your morning been? Can be a better way to just make it a little bit more manageable. But I think it's also interesting to think about us as VCs and how we influence our portfolio companies. And I had this just this week because we've been thinking a lot about mental health, and we've just made an investment in a company that we haven't yet announced, but it's in the mental health space to help companies support their employees. And we were talking about providing an amount of money for portfolio founders to invest in their mental health in a way that makes sense for them. And I was bouncing this idea off a venture partner, and she said, well, how many times have you and Matt talked about whether you've been through therapy or whether you've had, mental health crises along the way? And it was a really good challenge. And it made me think, of course, we haven't actually, explicitly said that to our portfolio founders. And so I think it's a fine balance. It's good to be open and vulnerable. It's also, it can be dangerous as well if you are still struggling with those things. You don't always want to let random strangers into, or people that you don't know super well, into something that's very personal. So I think it's going to be an interesting one as to how people navigate this. And maybe it's about you deciding kind of what are your circles of trust, and who's in the absolute inner circle, who's in the next one out and the next one out, and what are the kind of personal details that we should be prepared to share to invite them to share theirs in each of those circles.
One other note I just wanted to add there, check something you mentioned made me think about. Another thing that I'm doing is when I'm meeting with someone at the top of the meeting, just checking in to make sure it's still a good time and that they're prepared for whatever conversation we are supposed to have, because it's true that there's so much going on right now. And personally, I'm feeling this way that like, if I could cancel some meetings, I would love to, because typically I'm just like, there's just so much going on. I wish everything could slow down a bit. So I'm trying to enforce the fact that everything is not urgent right now and people are distracted. Of course we want to continue to get work done, but at a certain point, like on Wednesday, I was like, we're not having any more meetings today. Everyone just take a beat and let me know how you feel tomorrow. And if you still want to take another beat, that's fine too. So I think that's another thing that I'm trying to be mindful of and help my teams be mindful of, is just everything is not urgent. There's a lot happening. Let's just do what we can do, but not feel so much pressure all the time.
So we've now talked the talk a little bit. If anyone actually wants to answer the question, or if any, if one of you folks, not to put you on the spot, but thanks for agreeing to be on the spot. If someone wants to share and be vulnerable, you're welcome to do so, but we can also move past, because it's different being vulnerable in a 3 or 4 person conversation as opposed to, you know, the 350 or so people that are listening right now.
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about you know, having various, you know, feeling very anxious basically during the whole of COVID. I'm sure this has been something that a lot of people have felt, but you know, the constant news cycle of incredibly negative news. I've got both my sisters work in the NHS, which is under complete kind of crisis at the moment. Both myself and Matt have had coaching. You know, I've had coaching around impact and, you know, how to show up in meetings, and that's been incredibly helpful for me from a kind of confidence perspective. Currently, I'm doing a course on 21 Days of Abundance, which is a meditation course, which I actually have been sort of running for a group of people, and actually invited a couple of the founders that we work with into that. So that was just a kind of small way of talking about it, you know, starting up a conversation and normalizing that discussion in a workplace context.
That's awesome. Thank you. I would add that at its core, our job is as advisors and counselors, and it's what you said, Czech. It's been like, you know, we're in what month 9 or 10 of just daily unimaginable amounts of stress. There's no day where there's less stress. In fact, it seems like it's getting more, right? And the role of an advisor or counselor, you know, sometimes you just want to be like, I don't know, what the fuck, right? Like, don't know, right? But it's not really the job, right? Or it's not really the whole of the job, and it's hard. It's hard sometimes, you know, hard to advise entrepreneurs, and because what they're doing is so important and hard, and to imagine them doing it is just unimaginable sometimes. You know, just like, I don't know.
And on these topics, I will share that I said that the tweet from one of the partners at Harlem Capital changed the way I was going to approach something. So 7 years ago, my sister passed away, my older sister, and I didn't really tell anyone, because it was, you know, there's no place to go in that conversation when someone says, how you doing? And you say, my sister just passed away, right? It's not you don't recover from that. And shortly after she passed, Lou Reed passed away, the lead singer, guitarist, songwriter from the Velvet Underground. And as some people know, a lot of my friends are aware that I've been obsessed with Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground since my teenage years. And I mention it only because I felt very strange about having gotten more condolence emails on Lou Reed's passing less than 2 months after my sister's. And it, you know, I thought a lot about the way I grieved for that. So at the end of December, my mom passed away, and I decided to just tweet about it and share it, and to share that she was bipolar, and that was an important part of her life and of my life. And I mentioned it here not because I'm, you know, asking for condolence texts and emails, but because, you know, as Jewel said, like, when you are thinking about what you can cancel and what you can't cancel, and how you can lean in on a call that deserves more than the 30 minutes allotted, you know, these are questions. And I wanted to talk about bipolar and growing up in a house where that was an issue for 2 of my immediate family members, because we don't talk about it a lot, and because there's a lot of stigma around it. And I found it extremely rewarding to share that openly, and it made me realize that I had pretty much screwed up some other losses and my grieving for those other losses. So I loved hearing you say, Jewel, and we had not talked about this, but I loved hearing you say that you answered those questions honestly. And I don't always answer those questions honestly, but I guess it goes to the next topic, which is mental health. And I was also surprised to see in our survey that people wanted to understand what's happening in mental health and what are you doing for folks with mental health, and how are you making yourselves accessible to team when, you know, it has been a really busy period as well. And I know that there's also been in the last 24 months a lot more venture activity in mental health.
I've talked about what I'm doing and what we're doing in mental health. So I mean, it's really, really important to us. And, you know, we've had things in our personal lives as well lately that have made it even more critical. And we've had founders kind of go through their own sort of breakdowns. And I think it's a topic that people just still do not discuss enough, particularly as it comes to founder mental health. I think founders are one of the most high likelihood groups for having mental health issues. And I don't think there are many funds that really do much very practically on that, which is why we've designed this, you know, money that's now available for all of them. And it starts the conversation every single time we have a meeting with the companies. We're talking about it. And actually one of the portfolio founders does a mindfulness meditation session at the beginning of her board meetings, because she wants to, you know, situate everybody and, you know, talk about that before a meeting begins. And I think that's a great little kind of tactical thing that you can do. So I think that there's big things like actually providing hands-on help and coaching and, you know, financial support for that. And then there's the smaller things like making sure it's constantly, you know, on people's radar. And I think we as VCs need to do a lot more. Otherwise, I think that we risk creating an industry where we're funding people where that, you know, they're actually setting themselves up for failure because they're putting themselves under so much stress and so much anxiety. And I saw this firsthand because my husband ran a business, and, you know, he was working all hours of the day. He's getting up at 4 a.m, you know, going into the office and working all day till 10, and it had a terrible effect on his health. So yeah, I hope that we do a hell of a lot more on this than we're doing at the moment as an industry.
Agree. I experienced when I sold my company, and I've talked about this publicly, but I experienced what I would consider to be a crash and a really deep depression after selling the business. And so was kind of had a whole period of a couple years actually where I was dealing with the aftermath of that. So feel that I can see in a lot of cases can see sort of warning signs with founders and try to be really tuned into patterns and behaviors that I know I was exhibiting, you know, not taking care of myself, working all hours of the night. If I see founders sending me emails at 2 a.m., that to me is like, maybe I should check in. And obviously everyone has various sleep patterns at this point, but just trying to be cognizant of those types of things and do more regular check-ins with people that have nothing to do with the business, but really just how, you know, how are you feeling? How are things going? Just to make sure that they're not going down a path that might be destructive or just might not be good for their health. And then one of the things that we've done recently at Collab, we're still a new fund, so just set up our payroll and benefits and make sure that we put an allotment in for wellness, whether it's therapy or you know, mindfulness or whatever our team members need. So that was important. And I think, you know, 5 or 6 years ago, when I was putting the payroll package together for Part Pick, I wasn't even thinking about putting something like that in. But now I think it's really critical. So for the founders out there, if you have, I know budgets are always tight, but I think that's a nice thing that you can do for your team to make sure, kind of reinforcing that they're taking the time and taking the steps that they need to care for their mental health.
Really
The thing
appreciate
I'd
you
add is-
sharing that.
I mean, one thing we learned was that everybody's situation is different. Like we have to something that Andy and Czech mentioned, we have some people where the source of their stress is they are trying to homeschool and they've got two spouses at home. But we had people on the other end of the spectrum, single founders living in tiny studios in high-rise New York apartments in the middle of COVID, experiencing stress in very different ways and looking for really different outlets. And we have a very large portfolio. And what we found was really helpful was telling people like, oh, 9 of our portfolio companies that are in New York that are like going crazy, living in their studio apartments, a lot of them left. They went to go live with their parents. They went upstate. They got out of that construct because like that's not a healthy construct in COVID. And I think for a lot of the companies I talked to, the scary thing is like you don't want to think sometimes you're the only person having this problem or that you have to come up with the solution from scratch. And so in a lot of cases, what we found is we were able to help people figure out, well, other people like you in our portfolio who seem to be struggling with the same thing. I'm happy to put you in touch. Like, for example, when the George Floyd thing happened last year, which seems both very recent and with everything that's happened since then, very far away, we put all of our Black founders into one big group to talk specifically about how we were feeling as a community about what was happening, separate from your startup. And I was like, I feel like this group of founders in our portfolio needs a space to talk as a group. And like, we can't drive the conversation, but we can create the space for them to connect with each other and support each other. And so the thing, and those of you who know our firm, we're big on this, as important as it is what VCs can do for portfolio company founders, it's equally and maybe more important what founders can do for each other. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out who are the people in our portfolio who are similarly situated, maybe find someone who's a little farther along in solving the problem than you are and connect those people together. Because I do think part of the problem for investors is there's a power dynamic between founders and investors. And if you pretend there isn't, like, this is a very hard job to do honestly. And there are certain conversations that like, I want the founder to have an outlet. If I'm the outlet, that's great. If a peer, a friend is an outlet, it's great. I just worry about the people, to Jules' point, who appear not to have any outlet that's healthy.
So Charles, that I love that you did that. And in terms of founders, mentoring founders, that is a guiding premise of how and why we created VentureCrushFG. This whole program is about, and this year to solve some of these issues in some small way, we created pods, but the whole point is the founders asking one another questions, because there's something very human about finding the commonality. And if you have a question that you think is a stupid question, or is a question that underscores your own inadequacy or lack of experience, knowing that everybody else in the room or half the room has that same question is a really, really valuable reality check. One of the questions that has come up in this, and now that we've spent a bunch of time talking about the well-being and the culture aspects of things, how, as an investor, do you assess a portfolio company or a potential investment and their culture, and how much does that matter in the scheme of things?
Historically, or compared to the last year, you know,
To
I
the
mean,
extent that
yeah.
that historically has any frickin' relevance in today's world, go for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that like, I think at some level we probably all are. I believe that, that a company's culture matters. There's correlation between its ability to accomplish what it wants and how it does it. It's really hard to assess it from starting new, and then a checkup on the existing companies. Again, lots of conversations. Maybe you can kind of tease that out. I like this part about, can you have conversations where you create spaces for founders that you've invested in to open up, maybe in ways where they're like, hey, this shit's not working, or this isn't working. And I view that's an obligation on us to kind of be able to create this space for that. I think For new stuff, for new companies, it's really difficult. I don't actually know how to. I don't know how to do it. And I think probably if we were to stack rank kind of the criteria that we look at, I imagine that probably is gotten pushed lower down the stack. Maybe replaced with other things in your decision matrix, but it's hard to do. I haven't figured out a way to do it.
One thing that I think is really interesting is just, do they even talk about culture? Because so often you're in your first meeting, it's a half an hour chat, and they're talking about metrics and CAC LTV and the market and everything. And there are some founders that actually talk about culture so intentionally, and they think about it and they, obsess over it. And one of the companies that we were very lucky to invest in last year actually has this kind of labs element of their business where they have all these innovations that their team works on, and they have been from day one so thoughtful about the kind of culture that they're building, and it just shines through in every single interaction that you have with them. And I think this is not to say that everyone should go out and sort of make sure that you talk about culture and put that in your tick list when you're doing the first meeting with an investor, because I think it has to be aligned and it has to be authentic. And you can pick it up in little small things. Like at the moment, you're obviously sort of seeing people on LinkedIn. Sometimes I go on LinkedIn and I see that every single member of a team just has the banner, which has the name of the company and it has the logo and everything. And it's a small thing, or like all their profile pictures are the same. But it's just like you're thinking about how do you create cohesion in an environment where you're not meeting up in the office and you don't have any of that. You will kind of show up in the same way in your online presence, and you're happy to do that. So I think I think it's a huge sign for being a great founder, somebody who's intentional and thoughtful very early about culture.
So people are now changing their slide decks. Is that going to work with you, Charles? Joel?
I mean, I think the hardest thing about culture is I've never met a founder who's like, my goal is to create a crappy culture. Like, I never met one whose objective was to do that. I've also met many founders who think their companies have amazing cultures, and you ask the people who are subject to that culture, their point of view is very different. And so my general philosophy is that company cultures are an amplification of founder personality and idiosyncrasies. So if you understand that person's idiosyncrasies, their hot button issues, their quirks, their ticks, you can, generally speaking, draw a line between those. Those things will show up in the company in some way, shape, or form. And the question is, like, can you, in getting to know that person, begin to tease out those things that you see, and then find those things, figure out, well, if this person is very hard on himself or herself at all times, that's probably going to manifest itself in a culture that reflects that as a value. And like, what's that likely to mean? Well, maybe it's a company where employees don't feel appreciated or praised because like nothing's ever good. So like it's a little bit of like psychology, but I find that like the better I understand the founder, the easier it is for me to figure out, based on this person's orientation and worldview, what are they likely not paying attention to in their company? And I found for me, that's a better way to help the founder see that the culture that they're trying to build might not be the one that they actually have. And NPS surveys and employee surveys, things like that can be helpful. But I also just find creating space to talk to people about this stuff when you're the leader, and instead of saying this is our culture, and someone says, well, like, but the question I always ask people is, how are decisions made at your company? And the answer that people who are the recipients of the decisions versus the people who are involved in, like, I find it's almost always different. The founders will say, well, we have very spirited debate and we listen to everybody, and then we do what makes the most sense based on data. Yes, employees, well, we end up doing whatever the founder wants to do anyway. We do all this other stuff, but basically it feels like to me that what ends up happening is we do whatever she wants. And so I don't know, I encourage founders to always say, like, be skeptical that like the culture that you want to create has actually fully permeated the organization, and be open to the idea that like there are gaps between what you'd like to see happening. And I have a 4-person firm and we have gaps. There's things I wish happened at Precurse. We have 4 people and they don't happen always in the way that I would like. So I encourage people to be skeptical of like their ability to create this culture, not because I think they can't do it, but I think it requires vigilance. And I think it requires a desire to see if like the thing you want to be true actually feels true to the people who are doing the job on a day-to-day basis.
Charles, can I just add to that? Because I think it's really interesting, the point about what kind of behaviors dictate, what founder behaviors dictate what the culture is. And Matt and I did an interesting exercise recently where we talked about some of the sort of baggage that we were bringing to the job based on our sort of strange, histories and where we had worked and things. And, we both were kind of coming at our culture and our work behaviors with some sort of like quite odd, I don't know, assumptions that weren't necessarily objective, and we didn't necessarily know that we were doing it. And I had a similar conversation when I got married as well, because when you go into a marriage, you're sort of bringing a lot of your sort of family's baggage from what was normal to you there into that relationship. And I think until you talk about that and sort of say, actually, the reason why I think that working 16-hour days is just the way it should be is because that's what my parents did, or that's what I saw when I had my first job. And hopefully if you can kind of acknowledge that and own that, then you can separate yourself from it a bit and change your behavior, but also allow other people to come in and say, yeah, check, it is a bit weird that you think that we should all work 16-hour days, because there's other ways of doing it. So I think as leaders, that sort of self-awareness and bringing that to work with your employees is a helpful thing.
One of the questions that we talked about before this call was how people are struggling to transcend the network they had before COVID, and how you're adding to that network. And I appreciated that came up in survey responses. It came up in the conversations we had. Andy, you kindly indicated that was something that you were struggling with and thinking about, and Check as well. And Jewel, you gave what I thought was a really fascinating answer that I hope you'll be willing to explore. You said that for Collab, you had 2 LPs committed prior to the pandemic, and you now have, I think the number was 45, not my favorite number, but I think that was the number you used. And you had a first close, and you're now deploying out of the fund. You had a first close back in the summer, I think. So you've gotten comfortable with building new relationships. How are you doing that, and is it effortful and intentional?
It is both effortful and intentional. And I think it's just, I've not even thought about it really. It's just the reality of what will help me get to the destination I'm trying to get to, which is a closed fund. And this is the way that we've been able to and have had to make new relationships, because majority of the people that have come into the fund, we did not know prior to COVID. And so have had to meet them, get to know them, spend a lot of time, probably more time, several meetings, many reference checks. I have just gotten some text messages from folks who have been on the reference list. And that has actually surprised me, because I've never experienced so many people having to do so many reference calls, which is, I'm happy that I worked for a long time and had people that I can kind of switch out for that. But that has been the way. We've just had to set calendars up and have a lot of meetings, and get a lot of feedback, make revisions. We've gone through at this point probably 10 to 20 versions of the deck over the past several months. But my perspective has been, this is like what we have to do. I mean, I don't think it would be feasible for us to hold off on the fundraise. And luckily, there have been a fair amount of LPs who have been willing to do the work on their side to get these things done. But I would say I don't know, because I've never raised a fund before, how to compare it to what things were like when you could go and just have a couple hour meeting with someone and get them to feel comfortable. But yeah, it's been a journey for sure. I would be curious, actually, from Charles. You've raised a couple funds, and I think you've raised at least some portion of this last fund during COVID. So, yeah. What's the difference been like?
It's kind of strange. and maybe this is just like our firm's culture, we've been investing in people that we didn't know that well on Zoom and the phone pre-COVID, which a lot of my LPs were deeply uncomfortable with, and now it's like normal. So I guess we've always gone into this saying like, let's try to assess up front if this is somebody that we want to work with and do our homework. But let's assume that like most of what we will learn about working with this person, whether it's an LP or a founder, will happen after we've made the decision to work together. And that like the upfront part is really to screen out people that we really don't feel aligned with, and to believe that like we will get to know these. So it's weird, like we've actually tried to slow down the getting to know people part and say like, again, like with some of our new LPs, like some of them committed after like 1 or 2 phone calls, not crazy amounts of money. And my assumption is that like I have no illusion that I know them that well right now, but I now have like a license to get to know them over the next few years. And so I've actually decided to be this year much more intentional about getting to know some of our new LPs that I don't know that well in a way that I didn't think about before, because I was like, oh, they're going to come to our annual meeting, and when they come through San Francisco, they'll come by the office, they'll have a cup of coffee. Like that's not going to happen, I don't think, this year. And so now I've said, okay, well, I have to be, now that like these people are part of the Precursor family, now I have to make the investment in getting to know them, and I have to be more intentional about it, because the serendipity or the gatherings and rituals that we use to get to know our old LPs won't work. So I was stressed out about this in the beginning because we were fundraising in the middle of COVID, and we had to close the Friday before San Francisco went into lockdown, and basically over the weekend, every meeting I had for the next couple of weeks got canceled. People were like, you can't possibly think I want to talk about your little fund in the middle of a global pandemic. I was like, I know you don't. I sort of have to ask you to, but I know you don't. And I struggled. I said, well, how are we going to get to know people? And I said, most of our strongest LP relationships, people who are closest to the fund, I actually didn't know them super well when we started. Working together is how I got to know them better. And I was like, let's just trust that that will work as well in COVID as it did pre-COVID. It's just going to require, like I have a big list in our CRM of like all of our LPs and when was the last time I talked to them. And I pay a lot more attention to that data now than I did before. Before I was kind of like, I'm sure I'll see them at someone else's annual meeting, at some conference. And now I'm like, no. It's my job to make sure that we're investing in these relationships, and it's going to be harder and take more work because I can't use sort of physical proximity as a crutch.
Yeah, I think that the CRM, just adding to that, is really stepping up, and we're having to step up our CRM engagement. And as you said, Charles, actually working with people is the best way to get to know them. But with LPs, how do you find something to work with them on? You can sort of send them deal flow, you can syndicate things, but I think trying to understand what is it that really excites them, what's that sort of thing that you can really connect with them on, and then trying to, as much as possible, create discussions around that, or send them articles that are of interest and deepen that piece of connection that you've got, because that might be the only thing you have, and you may not be able to go for a glass of wine like we did in San Francisco when I first met you. It's a really difficult one. And I think now it's been almost a year since we haven't seen people. As Andy mentioned earlier, it's actually getting to the point where what is that even a relationship anymore if I haven't seen somebody in person for over a year and it's just been on Zoom? These are sort of in-person relationships that we once had. So I'm struggling with, how do I sustain those and create new connections rather than just, harking back to that one time that we met in person sort of runs out of road after a while.
Andy, let's take you out of listen mode.
Yeah, I want to. This is great. This is great listening to all this. I want to add just a couple of things that I thought of. One is, I think that to a large extent, most everyone in our little ecosystem here, investors, entrepreneurs, have worked really hard at making this work. You're like on a dime, and everyone's trying hard, and it's really super. Everyone's trying to okay, we guys got to keep, it's that forward momentum thing, that positive momentum, which is really amazing and encouraging. I think there are two things, and it could be because some other people here, Charles, et cetera, invest earlier and their decision making has been different. And so their process may not have changed, and which is amazing. For people investing a little later stage, one of the things is, your decision making, it looks and feels different. And one of the things that I have been kind of worried about is, in that situation, we will rely more on existing networks than people from outside those networks to get in. And there may be data to suggest that is happening. Actually, it's really hard because the data in this business is such a lagging indicator. But there may be data to what's happening, and which kind of sucks because. It sucks because it sucks, right? When you're trying to establish criteria for investing, trust being one of those, you're just going to go to the people you already know, or the people who know the people you already know. And I think at some level, we've fallen back on that, just at some level without thinking about it even. You just kind of do it, and then you look at a couple investments, you're like, of course, we worked with that person's brother or the school they go to or whatever, and I stress about that in general. I don't know, I stress that if you're not more aware of it, you won't notice it happening, right? And so it's probably on our obligation, like myself and my firm and firms like me, to just be more conscious about it. The second thing is, Charles said something really interesting, is that we went through a fundraise, and our fundraise is different than other firms because it's usually the same people. But we spent more time with our investors this year than we have ever before, because it was always like, I think you said that, Chuck, I'll catch up with you next time in Los Angeles or I'm in London. Well, there was none of that. So we ended up spending more time with them. And I feel like I got to know some of the people in our world a lot better than I had before, because that was like this, and so this gets you only so far, but it was like this a lot more, especially because if people were otherwise would have to come to visit us to meet, and then they'd be like, oh, I don't want to go to New York. They were like, let's 2:00. Here's the Zoom link or whatever, the Google Hangouts link. And so that's been good. I think that's been good with companies too, right? Entrepreneurs, I think, have to be very careful, because the friction for us to spend time with them, there's no filter. The filter used to be come visit, and that's not there. And so why not talk to 10 entrepreneurs a day, And so I think entrepreneurs have to be aware of that. But at the same time, I've met more people in the past year. I think it'll take some time to see whether that was beneficial to the world, and to the firm and that. But there is some of that. People seem to be more receptive to okay, well, it's just 2:00, right? And the interesting thing I've noticed over the course of the year is the standard time of a meeting now has gone from an hour to a half hour. It just kind of happened organically. I don't know if anyone else noticed that, but those calendar invites used to be an hour. Now they're always a half an hour, right? Because we're all a little bit sick of this. But so it's kind of a paradox in a way, right? There's more of that, more touch points. But I do worry that as investors, we will fall back upon existing networks in making the decisions.
A word about existing networks, and there's something that Czech dropped in the chat, which people should look at. There's a number that I heard, which is that of the 70 some odd trillion, I think, managed in PE and venture, if you limit it only to funds that are 25% or greater underrepresented, including straight white women as underrepresented, but 25% or greater, 1.1% is managed by underrepresented managers. And so if we do fall back to existing networks, that is going to be a real retrograde move for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the asset class. And I know that people also wanted to ask how you're evaluating founder relationships as investors. How are you seeing the chemistry as a team, a new team is pitching you? And how are founders meeting co-founders or hiring C-levels?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the point about the funding level that's dropped going to sort of female founders and diverse founders, because I think it also speaks to this point about sort of basically the game has changed in terms of what a founder needs to do and how they need to show up and what the pitch needs to be. And no one has any training for that. And if you've got an existing relationship with someone, or they went to the same school as your friend or something, then you've got so much more chance of succeeding in that half-hour slot. And I agree with you, Andy. Like I do half-hour meetings, but I think it does put a lot of pressure on that founder to come and be so slick and so clear about what their message is, and really, know exactly what's going to resonate with you. And I'm finding, even just, I've been in the industry for 6 years, I'm still finding a lot about different partners and who to pitch at which fund and what kind of style that partner likes versus that partner. And I think that there's just a sort of whole bank of knowledge that is either explicit or implicit that some people have and others don't. And so I think the more that we can sort of externalize those tips and give people the tools to succeed, if they don't have any of that, like saying, look, our pitch sessions are 30 minutes. They work best when you have a 5-slide deck. I'm going to do a Q&A for 10 minutes at the end of it. Or like, hey, this is a video of a successful founder that pitched us that we invested in. Just kind of being far more transparent with people so that they know what to expect. And maybe we can translate that. And hopefully when we go back to the world of being in person, I think it also makes the same sort of thing if you're a founder that's interviewing people as co-founders or people in your team, just managing their expectations and giving them the tools as much as you can to be successful in the interview is critical.
One of it reminded me is what you just said. It reminded me of two things. One thing that we did is anyone in the firm can join any meeting. It's only 19 people, but like, so pitches, instead of it being 10 people, it can be 19 people. And the idea was just to open things up, which I think demystified a lot of what we do to people in this weird environment. The weird part is that, like, if an entrepreneur comes in, there's like 19 people in the room, and the reality is you don't really have to, it's hard to find 10 minutes to the context there, because now you're down to 20 or 30 minutes left, and so that's why I think we're stumbling through that. I agree, the 30-minute thing is really interesting to me. I found that over the last 5 or 6 years that the business has gotten more transactional in some ways, and this has accelerated that. I think if you have 30 minutes, that's like, that's a transaction, that changes the scale to transaction away from a relationship. Maybe there's some positive aspects to that too. I don't know. I haven't really digested it, but it just does feel like every one of those meetings is like, there's a goal in mind for all of us to get to at the end of that 30 or 45 minutes, which is, an investment being made. And so, so that's kind of this thing I'm digesting. What are the implications of that over time and stuff?
It's funny, we moved to 30-minute meetings as a default first meeting about 2 years ago, mostly because what I realized is it allowed me to meet more people once. And so we try to be upfront with people. Like, the goal of the 30 minutes is not for me to decide to invest in your company. It's to decide if we should spend more time together, getting to know each other more. And so I agree. I think for some entrepreneurs, it doesn't feel great to only get 30 minutes. It's not enough time to tell the full story. But I generally find, as an investor, I can tell in 15 or 20 whether this is likely to be something that I can see us saying yes to. And it means I get more capacity. And my newest experiment has been, I don't know if any of you use Upstream, but I've been doing 10-minute office hours on Upstream, which is really just a chance to meet somebody and talk really, and it cuts you off at 10 minutes. There's not 10 minutes in 1 second. And like, what I've been trying to do in COVID is, how do I give more people a chance to get in the front door? Which means that, like, there will be shorter interactions and they'll be more focused. But I've had people graduate from a 10-minute Upstream get to know you to a full hour later, where I would have probably never given them, honestly, an hour up front with no context and no qualification. So I think about these 30-minute pitches, and again, our volume is 30 investments a year. So anything for me that increases the number of people it will actually probably show up in yield. For you, Andy, probably not, right? Like, you're going to you guys have a pretty focused model. So I wrestled with that, and I had a lot of people who were like, only 30 minutes? Is this like the JV? And I realized if everybody gets 30 minutes, it doesn't feel like, oh, you're not the 60-minute first meeting, you're the 30-minute. Oh, I was like, no, all of our first meetings, the ones I take are 30 minutes. Occasionally they're 45 if it's something technical. But I've just found that it helps me a lot in terms of giving more people who I don't know as well, to your point about network, a chance to get in front of us.
Yeah, and I always feel kind of guilty imposing on folks, and you do lose the ability when you're not in person. You lose some of the ability to lean into the moment and extend. And I'll mention I dropped a link on this. Two things, two links. One was a tweet from Kimberly Bryant, who you folks should follow on Twitter and in life. If you're not, she is the founder and CEO of Black Girls Code, among other things that she does. But she shared the December jobs report showed that women lost 156,000 jobs while men gained 16,000. Let's be clear, it was Black and Latino women who lost these jobs. And there's a thread. Obviously there's been some reinforcing of systemic bias and advantage and disadvantage during the pandemic. One of the things that I started doing, and this is the link I shared, is something called First Close Partners, which is a continuation of investing that I had been doing with my wife and occasionally with some friends into venture funds led by underrepresented managers. And over the years, my wife and I had invested in, for instance, a dozen venture funds where a majority of the managers, majority of the GPs were Black. 20 families of venture funds where a majority of the GPs were women, about 20 where a majority of the GPs had intersectionality. And we write small checks, and through First Close Partners, I'm doing that with Teresa Gao, who was at XL and is now at Acrew, and is the most Forbes Midas listed woman in venture, and Regina Benjamin, who was the Surgeon General under President Obama and is a MacArthur genius and all sorts of other things. And these are folks who've been friends of ours for years, and we're just investing our own capital. But through First Close, we've backed 20 venture funds already that are run by underrepresented managers in venture. We plan to do more. The checks are small, and so I don't feel like I'm entitled to an hour or 3 phone calls to get to a close, but I also want to get to know people. And there's something similar in how I angel invest, and the opportunity to make those bonds is much more, is much more limited. And I know that people, when they come to this kind of event, and like Andre, who I see on the screen in Prague at Credo Ventures, which is one of the best performing venture funds in Europe, is taking an hour and a half to be here. And like Andy said, be in listening mode. And Eric at Impact X, which is a diversity focused fund in London, is taking an hour and a half where he's not talking to founders that they want to back or potential LPs for their fundraise. And so one of the things that I'm also trying to think about is, how do we deliver value in that half-hour call or that hour and a half session like this? And how can the follow-up that is not in real time, right? The email follow-up, the text follow-up, whatever it is, deliver relationship builds so that you can expand network without imposing on folks and encroaching on their lives. And I don't know if people have thoughts on that, but that also seems like part of culture.
I have thoughts. It's very much part of culture. And my main thought is thank you for setting up First Close Partners, because it is so needed. And as a very proud recipient of a First Close check at Ada, it's critical. And we had a real cold start problem, which I remember talking to Charles about right at the start. Charles also was a first closer, agreeing to be on our steering group. But those people that are prepared to write that first check are incredible. And I remember when we were first pitching LPs, it was just actually the opposite problem. We actually wanted people to listen to us. We couldn't get enough time for people to tell our story. And when somebody asked us questions about how we were thinking about portfolio construction or what our fund model was, we were so excited because hardly anyone else was prepared to listen to the pitch just to do that. So I think, being there as a sounding board for them, and helping them practice that pitch and sort of being that friendly ear, because in the LP world, I think it's a sort of exaggeration of what we have with VC and founders in terms of the power dynamics. It's even harder to take the mask off and say, at times, we don't know what we're doing, and we're not sure what check size we should write. We're not sure what ownership, should look like, or what prices we should be paying. These are all questions that I think someone in your position who's seen so many first-time managers start out will be able to help figure out. And it applies more generally. I had some great advice from somebody once who said, how do you build real relationships with people? It's such a difficult thing to do. And he said, share problems. Just share problems with people, and then genuinely be interested and ask them for help with those problems that you're struggling with. And that is going to sustain and create and forge connections that you don't get when you're just in sales mode the whole time. So that's what I would say.
That's great. So we're down to our last 5 minutes, and I would love to continue this conversation. I want to just, if people have tips on recruiting, and maybe even thoughts about the interview process or widening the funnel, and if you also want to share any last tidbits or takeaways that you want people to have, even if they're off topic.
I have a slightly off topic. It's kind of going back to a previous topic. It's just something I thought about from Check's comments. One of the things, it was mentioned earlier about networks and folks not having an opportunity to expand outside of the folks that they already know because we're not in person, we're not going to conferences. One of the things that I've tried to be really intentional about, and I know Charles has also been intentional about because he's made some really incredible introductions for me, and Ed, you as well, is just making really high quality introductions for people and not being precious about the people that I know, and really trying to make people, help out people that may not have access to folks by making connections. And I think that's something that we can all do to kind of expand, what people are able to do in this time and who they're able to meet and know. So one, I just want to give a public thank you to Charles and Ed for making some really great connections for me. And then also just encourage all of us to do the same for people that may not have the same level of access, but have the talent or have something that's really interesting that somebody else might be able to benefit from.
Ed, I have something I wanted to chime in with, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
In cannabis, we are a second chance employer, which is a really important thing for social justice. We actually make it really clear that we seek out employees who have a nonviolent criminal record related to drugs. We also are a ban the box employer. So on any applications, we do not have a box about previous felonies. I really hope that the cannabis industry and what we're doing in terms of recruitment and social justice has a ripple effect on other companies in different industries. This makes a really big difference on our culture. Even though it's something that, when the PR person on our team gets a hold of this, they want to know, how many employees do you have that have these records? And the whole point is that you don't ask. So you don't actually know. But that should not be a stumbling block for people who want to implement similar programs. Because you have a work culture that starts on honesty and transparency, and then second chance employment and ban the box. The stories come up at employee gatherings or just in sidebar conversations. And it's a sort of core foundational part of our culture.
Yeah, and given the demographics on justice involvement, it is it is important to focus on how we help people reintegrate without stigma, and how we understand that one person gets just as involved on the same basis another person is completely unnoticed for doing the exact same thing, and it is life altering. So that's a cool point. Andy, Charles, check. Closing thoughts.
Well,
could just
first of all,
go
thanks for
ahead.
doing this. It's such a interesting conversation to like not talk about like deal flow and investment theses, but more something that probably is more top of mind. So I appreciate that. I would add only one other thing in hearing everyone is one thing I tried to do, like, I know probably like Ed, you and I, like we retreat to music. That's how we deal with stuff, right? And it's just a little thing, right? Like a song. And so I do in lots of conversations I have, it's just also focus on the big stuff is really messed up and complicated. Sometimes it's just the little stuff, and the little stuff can help. I know amongst our team, sometimes it's been more, we tried grand gestures and sometimes they work, and sometimes it's the little thing, like the book club is silly, but just everyone in your company reading the same book in the course of a week and having a little conversation about it just feels, those little things can have compounding returns in ways that feel new to me.
Charles.
The only thing I would add is, and thank you for your comments, Jewel. Like, part of what COVID has taught me is you should reach out to people that you care about, even if you don't have anything to ask or offer, just to see how they're doing. And that's not something I think I don't think I do a great job of it yet, but I'm getting better. But that's not something I really did pre-COVID, and I've tried to make more of a point to just reach out to people that I think are doing good work. Sometimes to check on them, sometimes to tell them I'm thinking about them, and sometimes I might have something for them, and trying to be more intentional in reaching out to people and not just waiting for everything to come back to you. And
Charles is freezing. Check, just so that we don't lose the momentum, and if Charles comes back in, he can interrupt.
Okay, I feel Charles is actually frozen in motion there. I'll stop talking as soon as he comes back. Look, I think that's a really good point, and this has been a phenomenal discussion about things that we don't talk about enough and should. I think on recruiting, just internships is something that got kind of done away with last year completely. It's such an important part of people's development as they're young in their careers. So if you can offer an internship of any kind, ideally paid, even if it's on Zoom, I think people appreciate it and allows them to get just some experience. We run an internship called Future VC, which is about getting internships into VC, and that's launching in New York on the East Coast, later this year. So if you're interested in that, totally happy to talk about that more, get in touch. We use a company called Applied. Now we've lost Jewel. It's the internet's going across the US, cutting down. So you on the East Coast are going to be off soon as well. But no, we use a platform called Applied, which screens out all information about CVs, and it just looks at attributes. And we're just doing a process right now using that platform. And we've designed a sort of scorecard that looks at the qualities that we want to have in that hire, as opposed to where they went to school or what they've done before. So it's quite basic stuff that a lot of people know already, but I think it's amazing how often in the heat of the moment, when you need to really find someone quickly, you kind of do away with the internship program and you do away with some of the sort of lessons that you might have taken in and done in times that were less busy and less hectic. But I think it's even more important than ever that we do this work around inclusive recruitment during COVID.
Yeah, drop a link to that program if you have it, or at least tweet it, and people should follow Check and Ada as well. I mean, you should follow all of these folks, I think. So thank you everyone. And Maureen Boyce from Good Growth VC, which is a great fund in the Southeast, is saying that she had 20, and I know she did. She had 22 interns last summer and still have 10 for their venture fund, and that's cool fun. And you folks should probably chat also. But thank you all so much. I know that this is not an easy topic and there's a lot we didn't get to, but I think that the pod discussions over the next week will be really good. I hope everyone stays safe, and I really want to thank all of you for giving us an hour and a half of your day, and Andy and Czech, and the other panelists now departed. Stay safe and be healthy and be happy.
Thank you so much, Ed.